Friends who often end up on the guillotine already know this. The most frightening inventions usually do not look like disasters at the beginning. They first show up looking civilized, respectable, and perfectly reasonable. They appear in rooms full of well-dressed people discussing institutional reform. They come wrapped in the language of doctors, legislators, and legal theorists. Their packaging says equality, rationality, reduction of suffering. The guillotine was exactly that kind of invention. It did not first arrive in the shape of madness. It arrived in the shape of progress, as if someone had finally said, "We are going to upgrade the old regime's cruel and outdated punishments." And then history reminds everyone that when you hear a sentence like that, you should never trust only the first half. Welcome to my channel. This is To the Lighthouse. Today I want to talk about a piece of black comedy so dark that it almost stops being funny. Why did a doctor become permanently tied to one of the most infamous killing machines in history? Why did the Enlightenment, the age that claimed to worship reason and humanity, produce a machine advertised as more humane death? And more importantly, why did an invention that began under the banner of reducing pain end up becoming the most visible symbol of the French Revolution's reign of terror, surviving all the way into the 20th century, surviving until France's last guillotine execution in 1977, and not truly leaving the stage until France abolished the death penalty in 1981. What makes this story so disturbing is not only the blood, it is the fact that it feels so civilized enough to make your spine go cold. The doctor's proposal. Let us begin with the man himself. Joseph-Ignace Guillotin was born in 1738. He was a physician, and during the early French Revolution he also served as a member of the National Assembly. There is an important misunderstanding that needs to be corrected right away. Guillotin did not personally design the guillotine. In fact, he was someone who argued against cruel forms of execution. The people more directly involved in the prototype were the surgeon Antoine Louis and a craftsman named Tobias Schmidt. In its early days, the machine was even sometimes called the Louisette. By that logic, Antoine Louis should be remembered as the real technical architect, but history has a strange sense of humor. The name that ended up attached to the blade forever was not the engineer's name, but the name of the man associated with the principle of humane reform. So guillotine became the one history nailed to the machine. Why did that happen? On October 10th, 1789, Guillotin proposed in the National Assembly that capital punishment should be standardized as decapitation, and that it should be carried out by means of a simple mechanical device. To understand why that mattered, we need to look at execution under the old regime. Nobles were generally beheaded with a sword or axe. Commoners were much more likely to face hanging, breaking on the wheel, or burning, punishments that were slower, more painful, and far more humiliating. In other words, even the manner of your death was divided by class. The Enlightenment loved to talk about equality before the law. But when you arrived at the scaffold, the old membership tiers were somehow back again. It was absurd. So the original appeal of Guillotin's proposal was not that he wanted to invent a more horrifying machine. The appeal was this: if the death penalty could not yet be abolished, then at the very least everyone should die in the same way, quickly, and with less suffering. Later, in a discussion in December of 1789, guillotine was associated with a line that became famous, perhaps partly because the press repeated it with a mixture of seriousness and mockery. Speaking of the machine, he supposedly said, "With my device, I cut off your head in the blink of an eye, and you feel nothing." To modern ears, that line sounds almost chilling beyond belief. But in its own moment, it expressed a very typical Enlightenment confidence. It reflected the belief that technology and institutional design could reduce cruelty to a minimum. Guillotin may not have liked the death penalty at all, but he believed that if it could not yet be eliminated, then it could at least be made less torturous, less theatrical, and less dependent on the old regime's humiliating gap between noble and commoner. The starting point was not evil. The problem is that history does not reward a respectable intention with a respectable ending. The confidence of Enlightenment. If we reduce the guillotine to nothing more than an upgraded blade, we miss what is most important about it. At a deeper level, it was the Enlightenment mindset translated into the domain of punishment. 18th century Europe, especially France, was enchanted by a certain set of ideals: reason, classification, uniformity, standardization, calculation, reproducibility. This was an age that produced encyclopedias in order to organize knowledge and legal theory, in order to turn punishment from revenge into system. One of the most important books in this intellectual background was Cesare Beccaria's On Crimes and Punishments, published in 1764. Why does that book matter so much? Because it represented an entire new philosophy of penal reform. Punishment should not be the revenge of an offended sovereign. It should be a necessary, rational, and minimally cruel instrument within a legal order. Beccaria repeatedly insisted that the state had no natural right to torment people at will. His central concern was how to make punishment more certain and more proportionate, not more spectacular, and not more savage. Even if we do not quote him line by line, we can still feel the atmosphere of the age. People wanted to leave behind the medieval world of public torture, bloody spectacle, and status-based punishment, and replace it with a more uniform and less agonizing modern judiciary. If we translate that into contemporary language, it almost sounds like a coalition of legal reformers and policy thinkers saying, let us build a system that is less emotional, less arbitrary, less privileged, and more consistent. It sounds advanced, it sounds humane, but once the state actually possesses an efficient, stable, universally applicable method of killing, then a much darker question appears. Does that system reduce violence, or does it simply allow violence to be carried out more smoothly? That is why the most terrifying thing about the guillotine is not that it betrayed the Enlightenment, it is that it resembled the Enlightenment too well. It pursued equality and achieved equality in execution. It pursued reduced suffering and achieved less resistance to execution. It pursued the abolition of aristocratic privilege and quietly folded death itself into a standardized administrative procedure. One of the darkest sides of modernity lives right there. Human beings do not always become cruel by first becoming irrational. Sometimes we become more reliably cruel precisely when we are calmly optimizing the process. When the machine began. And then history moved from theory to practice. In 1791, France formally established decapitation as the uniform method of capital punishment. In March of 1792, the relevant proposal became law. On April 25th of the same year, the guillotine was officially used for the first time in Paris to execute a highwayman named Nicolas Jacques Pelletier. That date matters a great deal. It did not happen at the height of the terror, it happened earlier. The guillotine was not improvised as an emergency weapon for the Reign of Terror. It began as a serious institutional reform. At first, many people even considered it a success. Compared with the old regime, where executioners might need several blows to sever a head, or where hanging could drag on horribly, the machine did seem faster and more equal. But the French Revolution very quickly dragged the machine into a different logic. From September 5, 1793, to July 27, 1794, France entered what we now call the Reign of Terror. The French Revolution was never a simple rising curve of liberty. It was also a story of fiscal crisis, collapsing monarchy, war, internal rebellion, factional conflict, and a revolution that kept accelerating itself. After the Republic was established, the revolutionary government found itself inside a state of near total anxiety. Foreign enemies surrounded France. Internally, there was the revolt in the Vendée and resistance in various regions. Paris itself had become politically feverish. Under those conditions, the state began to normalize the state of emergency and to expand the category of enemy without limit. During the terror, at least 300,000 suspects were arrested. About 17,000 were formally executed, while roughly 10,000 more died in prison or through extrajudicial measures. In the period known as the Great Terror, after the law of 22nd Prairial on June 10, 1794, Paris alone saw around 1,400 executions. At that point, the guillotine changed in meaning. It was no longer simply an instrument meant to reduce suffering within capital punishment. It became the most visible interface of the revolutionary state. Louis XVI went up. Marie Antoinette, the so-called headless queen, went up. Danton went up. In the end, Robespierre himself went up. There is something coldly absurd about this sequence. Yesterday, you could describe the machine as a symbol of equality, rationality, and republican justice. Tomorrow, you might become its next customer. The machine had no feelings. It had no loyalty. It did not care about yesterday's comrades. It cared only about procedure, only about lists, only about who had been defined that day as an enemy of the people. Once history reaches this stage, one fact becomes painfully clear. Efficiency and justice are never automatically tied together. Efficiency is only efficiency. The real question is who it serves. Virtue and terror. If guillotine represented the Enlightenment belief that death could be made less painful through rational reform, then Robespierre represented what happens when that rationality is pushed into political absolutism. In his speech of February 5, 1794, Robespierre said it with striking clarity. In times of peace, he argued, the driving force of popular government is virtue. In times of revolution, it is both virtue and terror. Virtue without terror is powerless. Terror without virtue is fatal. Terror, he said, is nothing other than prompt, severe, inflexible justice. That passage matters because it is not the incoherent rant of a madman. It is a complete political logic. And precisely because it is complete, it is more dangerous. Look closely at the turn inside that argument. Terror is no longer the opposite of justice. It becomes justice accelerated. Robespierre was not saying, this is unpleasant but necessary. He was saying something more radical and more frightening. He was saying that in extraordinary times, terror itself becomes a form of justice. That is where the real danger begins. Once a political community comes to believe that it represents not only the people but also virtue, and not only virtue but also the direction of history, then violence acquires an almost sacred authorization. When the blade falls, it no longer appears merely as punishment, it appears as purification on behalf of history itself. That logic did not end with the French Revolution. It remained painfully modern. This is why the tragedy of the guillotine is so important. It was not a relic of some primitive age. It emerged from the language of progress, from the language of the Republic, from the language of reason, once those languages were drawn into extreme politics. At first, the machine was supposed to reduce the theatricality of torture. In the end, it became the most famous spectacle of all. The square, the crowd, the counting, the lists, the wheels of the cart grinding over stone, all of it became part of political theater. The state no longer displayed its power through prolonged torment. It displayed its power through rapid, equal, repeated execution. That is what makes it more modern, and therefore even more disturbing. What literature saw? This is where literature becomes especially useful. Historical documents can give you numbers, political speeches can give you logic. But when it comes to writing the terror of efficiency into the human heart, fiction is often the sharper witness. Let us begin with Charles Dickens and his 1859 novel, A Tale of Two Cities. The novel is set between London and Paris during the French Revolution, and it follows the lives of the Manette family, Charles Darnay, Sidney Carton, and others as they are pulled into the machinery of history. It is not a work of formal historiography, but its grasp of the social psychology surrounding the guillotine is remarkably precise. At one point, Dickens describes the guillotine as that newly born sharp female called La Guillotine. That personification is brilliant. The guillotine is no longer just a machine. It becomes a rapidly growing political deity, newly born and already hungry for lives. Dickens also gives us an even more chilling insight. He writes that the guillotine became a popular theme for jokes. It became a fashionable symbol, a cure for headaches, a way to prevent gray hair, the national razor, even something that had displaced the cross. What is terrifying here is not simply that the machine kills. It is that people begin to joke about it, to fold it into everyday slang, to treat it as part of the Republic's new aesthetic. A society often becomes most dangerous not when it openly admits its cruelty, but when it metabolizes cruelty into wit. In today's terms, it would be like mass political violence somehow turning into a meme, a catchphrase, something light enough to pass around casually. At the end of the novel, Dickens gives us another unforgettable image. As the tumbrils arrive at the execution ground, the knitting women count the heads as they fall. 1, 2. And by the time a young seamstress is executed, they have reached 22. That detail is so important because it captures the deepest horror of the terror. Not violence as a single eruption, but violence as enumeration. Not rage, but routine. Not passion, but procedure. One head falls, and the people beside the scaffold barely need to look up before continuing the count. At that point, the guillotine is no longer merely a state machine. It has become part of society's rhythm. Life itself has been compressed into countable units. Then there is Victor Hugo's 1829 novel, The Last Day of a Condemned Man. And this is one I personally love, because Hugo is so good at forcing morality back into systems that prefer abstraction. The perspective of the novel is fascinating. Hugo does not give us the grand revolutionary narrative. He gives us the inner life of an anonymous prisoner awaiting execution. Who condemned him, and why matter less than the psychological experience of waiting. Hugo is interested in how the approach of death slowly devours a person's sense of time, body, and self. There is a brief line in the book that lands with real force. The guillotine is a permanent fixture. In another formulation often associated with Hugo's critique, the machine appears almost like an expensive luxury. On the surface, that sounds ironic, but the irony cuts deep. The state spends money to maintain an apparatus, a procedure, personnel, and ritual for lawful killing, and then calls the whole thing order, justice, civilization. Hugo's real question is devastatingly simple. Are you defending law, or are you merely using law to institutionalize revenge? That is something literature often sees earlier than official history. The problem with the guillotine was never only whether it could save a few seconds of pain. The deeper problem was that once the law began to rely on such a machine, the state would become increasingly comfortable imagining death as something manageable, optimizable, and administratively executable. And once death enters the logic of project management, the face disappears first, the name disappears next, and what remains is a list, a number, and the repeated fall of the blade. Literature preserves the moments before that erasure, when the condemned are still irreducibly human. The machine did not leave. And here comes the most bitter irony of all. After the French Revolution ended, the guillotine did not leave with it. It was not sealed away as a regrettable relic of revolutionary excess. On the contrary, it continued as France's official method of execution well into the 20th century. France carried out its last execution by guillotine in 1977, and only in September 1981 did the country formally abolish the death penalty and finally abandon the machine. That means the supposedly humane device institutionalized during the Enlightenment remained embedded in the legal system for almost 2 centuries. That time span tells you almost everything you need to know. And that is why I think this subject matters so much. This is not simply an exotic story about French madness. It raises a question that remains painfully alive. Why do human beings keep imagining that if violence is made more rational, more standardized, more hygienic, and more procedural, then it somehow becomes less violent? The answer is usually no. Violence does not become noble because it wears a white coat. It does not become innocent because it is written into law. It does not become gentle because it becomes faster. The thing about the guillotine that still makes the skin crawl is not only the blade, it is the tone of confidence, the tone that believes it is making progress. That is why the name Guillotine is so tragically ironic. He wanted to reduce the cruelty of execution, and some have even argued that humanizing execution was, in his mind, a first step toward abolishing it altogether. But history did not remember the moderate intention. It remembered the falling blade. A doctor, an Enlightenment reformer, a man who wanted to separate death from privilege and torture, ended up becoming the symbolic spokesperson for the state's efficient killing machine. That contrast feels almost like the kind of joke history enjoys making most. If I had to leave one sentence with you at the end of this video, it would be this. The guillotine is not simply an exception, not merely a case where the Enlightenment failed. It is what happens when one of Enlightenment's shadows is amplified. It reminds us that reason matters, equality matters, reducing suffering matters. But the moment those words are detached from sustained suspicion toward power, they can easily be turned into tools for more efficient harm. Some of the most terrifying machines in history are not built in barbaric ages. They are built in civilized societies, After careful argument, public debate, legal approval, and then they begin operating in broad daylight. That is all for today's video. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, and see you at the next Lighthouse.